be wherever you are. Um, let's get started. So, why are we here? I frequently like to include a why we're here slide, kind of set the tone and get people to understand what's the point here. If you remember back, and IBMI itself has been around now about 36 years, right? Um, but a long, long time ago, we gained the ability to host, believe it or not, OS/2, NetWare, and Windows servers in what was then titled OS 400. Now, at that point, we needed a FizzieOp, which was an extra card stuck in there. And later we used an integrated X series server to run those bits. But it was the beginning of our hosting environment. Sometime later, we gained the ability then to partition our AS400s, and with that, we got the ability to host Linux partitions. That's what came first. There was no HMC at that point yet. There was a whole bunch of stuff that you had to do in service tools to make that work. But then in 2004, with Power 5 processors, we added AIX to the mix. So now we could host Linux and AIX, and all that other Windows stuff was still there. I think NetWare was gone by then. OS2 was gone. But then we got Power 6. And with the Power 6 machines and IBMI 6.1, you needed both of those. Even though 6.1 would run on a Power 5, you needed a Power 6 to run IBMI as a hosting a guest partition. So we were now, if you will, complete. We had that ability to host almost anything at that moment. And then we got VIOS, and VIOS would run on Power 6. You could do that. But that's where the battle began. So we're going to talk about that comparison between an IBMI partition as a host and a VIOS partition as a host. We're going to take a side-by-side look at more than 30 points here, and we're going to, point out what the pluses and the minuses are of each of those options. We're not going to make a choice. That's you. You get to look at your system and your company and your needs and say, well, we're going to do this or that, and that whichever fits the best. You're going to be able to keep score here. And I will say that IBMI 7.4 is the base for this discussion, but all of this stuff is true for IBMI 7.5 and also IBMI 7. Oh, I can't say that. iNext. Yeah, it's good for iNext as well. Here's a sample slide for our discussion. So on the left, over here, we have IBMI as a host partition, and this is the format all the slides will take from this point going forward. And IBMI has got the blue color, VIOS over here has got the green color, because if you don't know this, VIOS is actually AIX under the covers with a command shell, basically. VIOS itself is a shell on top of AIX. And one of the things that you would notice if you've done a lot of AIX over the years, or sorry, a lot of VIOS over the years, is some of those VIOS upgrades come with an AIX upgrade as well. So current level of VIOS is the most current level of AIX underneath it. So in the top, we'll describe it a little bit. Down in the bottom, we'll give some additional discussion about that. And then this slider bar was added to the presentation after I'd done it a few times, and it's called the Advantage slider. And so right now it's dead in the middle. And what you'll see is this is Larry's opinion of who has the advantage, right? Left or right on the slider bar. And so you can agree or disagree, that's okay. And remember, the target here is the customer who has a power system. Maybe you're looking to upgrade it. Maybe you just need another partition. Many times we see customers say, wow, we have a production partition, but we do our development there. I had a customer just a couple years ago in exactly that situation. Then they went public, the company did, and all of a sudden it was, no, you can't do development on production anymore. That's not allowed. You have to have another partition. So what's the direction that you go? Where do you go with VIOS in that direction as the host, or do you go with IBMI as the host? So This is the scorecard, if you will. All right. So we're going to talk about each of these items, several slides in some of the cases, but interface, hosting virtual media, networking support. We'll talk about cost a little bit, knowledge levels, maintenance considerations, hosting, operating system save and restore, support for SANs, host operating system disk support, internal disk support, and then advanced technologies, and we'll define what each of those are. But this is the list we're going to go through. So these are the things where you're going to score. You want IBMI? Did IBMI win, or did Power VM VIOS win for you in that category? So first, a few terms so that we're clear on that. A host is a partition that owns some resource. Typically, it's going to own disk, but it also can have tape, optical devices, and networking are the things that are shared through that host. So the host owns it and shares it. The client is the partition that consumes those resources. So that again, it may be consuming disk, network, whatever, but the host is you typically have one of those, and then the client is the guy using those resources. NPIV is a technology called its Endport ID virtualization. And what this does is it allows the same fiber channel adapter to be virtualized so that it's supporting multiple partitions simultaneously. We'll touch a little bit more on that through the presentation, but essentially it's virtualizing fiber channel adapters. An SEA, or a shared Ethernet adapter, is similar, I want to say the same, but similar to the way those fiber channel adapters are virtualized, but it's doing it for Ethernet. So you can run multiple VLANs and multiple partitions through the single shared Ethernet adapter. SRIOV is a newer technology, single root IO virtualization, and in this case, a single card can be presented to multiple partitions at the same time, and they share the card. They don't have to go through a host for that. Virtual SCSI is in many ways similar to NPIV in that you can make multiple partitions see disks on the same storage through virtual SCSI. It's clearly not the same as NPIV, but to the client partition, it looks much the same. And then VNIC, or virtual NIC, is the ability for multiple VIO servers to use SRIOV to get you connectivity to the network. SRIOV typically is going to get you higher throughput than an SEA will. So that's why we go down that path. And of course, FUBAR, that's what you want to avoid. So let's get started. So starting with the user interface. So in the case of IBMI, we're going to talk about the GUI support in the host operating system. So on IBMI, we have Access Client Solutions. If you don't know what that is, it's possible you're in the wrong session. Access Client Solutions has been around for a long time now. That's the desktop software that you use to access IBMI. Does 5250, does SQL, does navigation through the IFS, all of that. And of course, IBM Navigator for I, which is web interface built into IBMI. And that thing has gotten a big overhaul in the last couple of years. Very, very powerful, very usable. That's the GUI support that's built into IBMI. What does AIX have? Well, you can use the HMC. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So if you look at the Advantage slider bar down here, you can see that thing is solidly on the IBMI side, right? The HMC, I will say, has gotten dramatically better. And if you're a user of an HMC that's up to version 10 code, most of those really ugly pop-ups are gone. But you're still stuck using that as your only tool. Whereas with IBMI, you have a very powerful built-in network or a web-based client and also the desktop client. So solid win there for IBMI on that ID. Now command line, yeah, what can I say? We who are IBMI people know exactly when to omit vowels in our commands, and we know how to key those commands. We key those commands almost from our sleep. They have very good and extensive help text. They also have menus. Every now and then, I still find myself, after being on this platform since the first day it was announced, I still find myself going, I don't use that command much. It's on this menu over here. I'll go grab that. We also can do copy and paste into the command line. We have F9 to go forward, retrieve backwards, and F8 to retrieve forwards. We can search our commands. We can use Q command to show the command line history, page back in there, tag a command, hit F9. And of course, we can run virtually anything in batch. So just really, really solid. And we know how to use this. Us IBMI folks, yeah, it's in there. Now, AIX, really VIOS here. There's almost zero help. There's no up and down command retrieval. There's no command editing. Steal a line from an old neighbor of mine. Gadzooks, what a mess, right? And you can see where the slider is. It fell off the end of the bar. It's so far to the left. In this case, it's just literally, I mean, I don't know what you can say. Now, some people will say, oh, you can fix that VIOS thing. All you have to do is this. Right. How many of you knew that? Yeah. No. You type that in. No. I mean, it mostly works, but wow, that's like ridiculous. So let's go to hosting virtual media. So virtual media, we all use image catalogs and that sort of thing for our PTFs. Most of us will use that for our upgrades and such as well. Um, and so comparing the two with IBMI, it does certainly support sharing those as a host. It also supports automatic disk changing. So if you have downloaded PTFs from Fix Central and you've got six PTF disks in there, for example, in an image catalog, and you share that, the client disk, it'll just automatically ratchet through those disks. If, for example, you use install PTF command, right? The limit is really how much disk do you have? And the names are 10 long, so I suppose in theory you could run out of names, but you'd have lost your mind by then. You can also copy them, save them, move them, and additionally you can flag them so that they're not backed up. So if you do have a whole bunch of image catalogs and you say, look, these are transient, they're PTFs, they're going to go away and get replaced next month, I don't want to back them up, you can flag them so that they don't get saved in a normal save. Now, if you look at the VIOS side, can you have multiple hosted image catalogs? No, you get one. It's called the repository. And multiple clients can use that repository at the same time. That much is good. And they can be reading different disks from the repository, which is also good. But to change the disks, you actually have to connect to VIOS and say, okay, client 1 needs disk 2 and client 2 needs disk 5, and you have to do that, right? And loading and deleting them, you got to go through OEM setup environment, or optionally through the HMC web GUI. So again, a solid win here on the IBMI side for image catalogs. Can I restrict virtual optical to a specific guest? And the answer for both is yes, no problem at all. However, for IBMI as the host, they are allowed by default. Compare that to VIOS where they are restricted by default. So on a default configuration in IBMI as a host, every client will be able to see those image catalogs versus VIO, which is the other way around. Now, there is an option, and this came in maybe 7.3 or something. The original was only to restrict, but now we have the ability to choose whether we want to allow by default or restrict by default in IBMI. The original default is still allow, but you can now when you're creating the network server description, you have the option to say, nope, I only want to allow client A to see this optical drive and client B can see a different optical drive. So, but with VIOS, it's always restricted by default. Now, how about network-based install or PTF media? Well, this is kind of not really a virtualization thing from a hosting partition, but the way that network-based media works, and some of you may be surprised to find this, but did you know you can install IBMI over a network? A lot of people don't know that. I know it's pretty new, hasn't been around that long. It came with release 6.1. Oh, wait, that is quite a long time now, isn't it? And you can do PTFs over the network, and you can do backups over the network and restores over the network. That's newer and does require certain VTLs. But network-based install and PTF media, again, you can have as many disks as you like. They are supported over virtual LANs as well as physical connections. You can connect as many clients as you want because it's all TCP/IP and mostly based on NFS. Okay. With AIX/VIOS, the answer is, well, if you have a NIM server, and in some cases the HMC does act like a mini NIM server, and I'm going to put a disclaimer here that the AIX guys might go, oh, no, Larry, you're way wrong. You could do this and this and this, but it's not normal, right? VIOS doesn't have that built in. You'd have to, go into the command line and do stuff in there to make that work, as opposed to it's well documented on the IBMI side. So we're going to give IBMI the win on that category as well. Can you install from an HMC to a bare system using IBMI? Well, I've not seen a way to do this. I'm told you can, but I always go back to, I just use my network media and I boot off that. So why do I have to reinvent the wheel? Versus with VIOS, the answer is yes, you can. And I have, in fact, built an entire VIOS and AIX machine for a customer that I never saw the machine. They got me on the HMC. We were able to upload the media to the HMC, install the VIOS from there, and it effectively turns that HMC into a NIM server at that point. And it's great for a remote install. So from that perspective, VIOS gets the nod significantly there. But this is an install thing, not a daily operational thing. So let's look at something a little bit more normal, networking support. So when you start talking about networking, we have to ask about IPv6. And one of the things I love to do when I'm doing an in-person conference is I always ask, okay, anybody in the audience who's using IPv6, please raise your hand. And so far, and I do a lot of presentations, the grand total, add them all up, of all the presentations I've ever done where somebody said I'm using IPv6, one guy. So there's a guy. So somebody does. Both IBMI and VIOS support that. Network aggregation. So what is this? So network aggregation, for those of you that don't know what that is, Ether channel and LACP is a specification that basically Ether channel started with Cisco. And they said, how about we take more than one physical connection and logically we treat them as if it's one connection. So let's say you had 2 gigabit ports and you logically connected them. You would logically have about 2 gigabits of throughput. Bonus. You would also have some redundancy there. So if one of those cables got pulled out or somehow a port failed for any reason, the other cable takes over all the traffic. And so I get redundancy there. LACP is a more formalized version of that that's recognized by most switch vendors. And that's available in IBMI. It's been in there since version 7 release 1. And so you can definitely use that as part of your hosting environment. However, if you look at the VIOS side, um, it's been in there for longer, and the LACP is 802.3 AD. That's the specification name for that. And it's more of a normal thing. AIX has always done way better than IBM in the networking space. And if you've been coming to sessions, common conferences, for example, for a long time, there used to be speakers at those conferences talking about networking, and they always shook their heads. You IBMI people are so far behind the AIX people. Okay, I'm sorry. Quit rubbing it in. Um, so I would give the nod here to the VIOS side. They've done a better job of that. Network bridging. Well, the network bridge is actually the piece of code that's running in your IBMI host partition. And you don't really think about it as a bridge, but it is, because you have the IBMI host partition is connected off to the network with physical cables on physical adapters. And then you have your client partitions, which are on the inside, and they get virtual adapters. You don't have to give them physical adapters. That's part of the whole benefit here. And so the IBMI host partition functions as a bridge. It takes the traffic from the internal network, hands it over to the external network, and it's now placed out into a switch, for example. Inbound traffic goes the other way, winner, winner. But in the IBMI world, you want that bridge to be just a bridge. You never want to put an IP address on the Ethernet lines that are used for that, because if you do that, every single packet on that bridge gets handed to the host partition. Hey, is this your packet? Hey, is this your packet? What are you going to do with this packet? Lots of extra overhead is consumed there. So we don't like to do that. On the VIOS side, it's called an SEA, or shared Ethernet adapter. Works very well. It is really a bridge. And when you configure it, you're doing logically the same thing. You're saying, here's my internal adapter, here's my physical adapter, connect those two. But it has a thing called large buffer support, where big blocks of data from IBMI get dumped out, and VIOS, VIOS can grab that, stick it in memory, and get it out to the network as fast as it can. So large buffers, that's distinct from jumbo frames. Don't think about that. But this can reduce the CPU load and improve the throughput. And of course, it can also use an aggregated link for the bridge, just like IBMI can. So those aggregated links can be up to 8 connections aggregated together. I've never seen anybody do 8. Most I've seen is about 3, but it's available. Now, VLANs. If you're in a hosting environment like I work in, man, we got so many VLANs, it's nuts. And it's a good thing that both of these environments support VLANs, because even most of my customers now do have multiple VLANs in their networks. And in the case of IBMI, you really don't do anything with the VLAN. You configure the port on the switch as a trunk, you configure the virtual port as a trunk, and you build the bridge, which in the IBMI space is you merely create two Ethernet adapters that are connected together, and you're done. Now, because the virtual side can only have 20 VLANs, that's your limit in IBMI, is 20 VLANs on a single bridge. You can build multiple bridges if you'd like. However, in the VIOS side of the house, that's part of your SEA support again. Only VLANs specified in the SEA are connected. So you do have to define them there. So that's a little bit of an extra step, but it's good for security. However, in VIOS, you can connect multiple virtual networks to the same bridge. So each of them can have 20 VLANs. So it's 20, 40, 60, 80, however many you'd like to connect to that same SEA. So definitely a winner there on the VIOS side. More capability. VNIC, IBMI says, what's a VNIC again? It doesn't have any concept of that. In the VIOS world, it is complementary to SEA support. In other words, you can have SEA and VNIC on the same VIOS. You would not typically assign both of them to a same guest partition, but you can. And what it does is it allows redundant SRIOV adapters to assign to a guest. So if you have a partition that's a very key partition that needs high throughput, remember in the power system space now, we can actually go all the way to 100 gigabit networks. I don't imagine that many of you have those, but they are out there and they are available. They've been available for a number of years now. Um, but if you have partitions that have very high throughput requirements, you can assign a slice of SRIOV through each of the two VIOS partitions, and now you get you also get the ability then to have redundancy with that. And I'm going to mention it here. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but LPM or live partition mobility is supported for VNIC over SRIOV. So, so you'll see the slider here is significantly on the VIOS side in this particular piece of networking. SEA/bridge. So bridge is in the IBM space, SEA in the VIOS space. What can we do for redundancy there? IBM, not so much. Okay. Um, you could, in theory, have two IBM partitions, each doing this, but that's just not a normal thing. So you're really stuck without any true redundancy. You can have redundant connections using LACP or Ether channel, so you're redundant that way. And you could even run those to different physical Ethernet cards because those ports don't have to be on the same card. In fact, we recommend they're not just for that reason, better redundancy. But if one of those lines were to fail, you'd lose your connectivity. In the case of VIOS, though, when you have two VIOS, and that's a really good idea. That is absolutely the recommended configuration. You build the two SEAs the same, and then traffic will run back and run on one or the other VIO servers. And even if it has to switch over, typically if you were running a continuous ping, you wouldn't even see a single ping loss. Right? Traffic just continues. So again, pretty good win for VIOS in that case because it has better redundancy. IP routing support, sure, both can do that. We don't typically use IBM as a router. I've done it. But it's like, the children's books with Tigger. We give routing to the routers. It's what routers do best, right? Same thing is true in VIOS though. So dead even, both default to routing being turned off. So let's talk a little bit about cost. Everybody wants to consider cost. It's a valid thing. The operating system cost for IBM, you need to have licensing for that partition, and the price is going to vary by a P group. So if your very, very common machine is a P group 10, so you need to have a license for your hosting partition. Now, consider you don't probably need an entire processor. It's pretty rare that we actually do need a whole processor for the host, but you are using up some of your IBM processor that you've licensed in that case. In the case of Power VM, though, that is part or VIOS. It's part of Power VM. And VIOS then is usually run in processors not being used for IBM. So you get a machine today, let's say you have a P10 machine with 8 cores, and you need 3 cores to run IBM. That leaves 5 extra cores. A couple of those cores could easily be used for Power VM VIOS, and at exceptionally low cost. Not zero, because you are paying Power VM maintenance, but it's in the hundreds of dollars versus IBM license for a year is in the many thousands of dollars, right? So pretty good size win here for VIOS. Disk arms required for the host. Now, in the case of hosting, where IBMI owns all the disk and everything, the default is for IBMI to live on some of that disk space. The recommendation is that you could then say you had, 4 small drives that run the sysbase for that partition, and then all the rest of the disks are configured as an independent ASP, and you put all of your hosted storage in that independent ASP. But in that scenario, um, you can add as needed to the independent ASP. There's even some people that have used Power VM or Power HA, sorry, to replicate that independent ASP to another machine. That's a different conversation, but it is a valid and doable thing. In the case of VIOS, strong recommendation that you have 2 disks for VIOS. Those 2 disks are mirrored, and so that's all you use for VIOS itself. And if you're going to use VIOS to virtualize storage within the machine, then all of those disks, the remaining disks, would be mirrored also, and then your guest operating system will live on that extra storage. Okay. Much of VIOS, though, is used for SAN storage. And in that case, you can actually have VIOS itself boot from the SAN. Don't need any disk internal at all in that case. So let's look at knowledge level. We touched on this a little bit when we talked about command line and stuff, right? So for IBMI shops, you already know IBMI. This is not an operating system you're unfamiliar with. And so you need to learn work network server storage and work network server description and some function keys in there, but mostly that's what you're learning. You're learning a couple more commands. And you can do all that through Navigator for I if you'd like. When you go to the VIOS side of the house, though, my claim is it's unbelievably massive, ginormous, huge, complicated, and also frustrating. Now, when you're using all SanDisk, it's definitely better because in the SanDisk scenario, all the disk work is done on your storage. So typically that's Flash Systems today. And so you would go over there, you'd have a host. If you had a partition that needed some additional disk, you can just create more storage, map it to the host, and it shows up on IBMI. So admittedly then, once it is set up, the HMC does do most of the work these days, but there's a lot of things you got to get right in VIOS before you can start hosting. So the knowledge there, definitely a big win on the IBMI side. Excuse me, I had a cough there a second. Um, so let's look at maintenance considerations. So call home support. Call home has been as part of IBMI forever. My first interaction with it was way back when I like to say when the paint was white, right? The AS400 machines and the white box. We tried to configure a connection to a bank and we were told that the line was busy. Well, how could the line be busy? It was busy calling IBM to tell them that we had a disk failing. So, bravo for that. Um, and it's been in there. It's very simple to configure. It's been annoying you to configure it and continue every time you IPL. Hey, do you have you haven't configured call home? Oh, really? Versus VIOS, it relies on the HMC, right? There used to be some stuff in VIOS, but that's out. So, again, a pretty good win here for IBMI, and it's very straightforward, something we've done forever. We have one question I want to touch on. What factors determine processor allocation for the hosting partition? The comment was that their first partition, they had 2/10 of a core for the hosting partition. I can't tell you that 2/10 of a core is too much or too little. I would suggest less than that is probably bordering on too little. But realistically, for the most part, that host partition needs to have enough memory and processor to do the I/O to the disks. And in that configuration, one of the memory pools you typically create is a shared pool to act as a RAID cache or a write cache, so that the client partitions can write to that cache, and then the host writes it out as fast as it can after that. So um, we really look at performance tools. And of course, if you have 27 guest partitions, your host is probably going to need more CPU as well to deal with that, right? So it's really going to come down to watching performance in that scenario. So for service tools capability, if you know IBM service tools, it's extensive, it's well known, it's trusted, it's all menu driven. Um, you can create separate profiles in there. You can very easily say that, Jim gets to do that and Bob gets to do another thing and Mary doesn't get to do anything. But Susan is a guru and gets all the options, right? I mean, you can go down that list very simple. It's been consistent for 20 plus years. And it's just, and IBM knows it as well, right? In the VIOS world, it's really AIX. So for us IBMI guys, it's just not at all friendly. And there's lots of options in there that make very little sense to the IBMI admin. And it's very frustrating to find functions. So we give the win to IBMI in that space quite strongly. The fix application process. Well, I wish I knew how many PTFs I've done in my lifetime, or maybe I don't. But the process is very solid. It's very well known. It's very documented. And I know a guy who does a lot of presentations on PTFs, and you might be looking at them. Additionally, the problems that are identified are fixed generally individually, and it's an IBMI strength. We know that we can get in there and do a cum. We can say, hey, we want these fixes, and we don't need those fixes over there because we don't do WebSphere, we don't do Domino, whatever, right? So there's a lot of stuff there that we know how to do this. When you deal with AIX, though, specifically VIOS, it's a genuine pain in the backside. Okay. Fixed levels. This is legitimately a real fixed level. Now it's not current, but fixed level 2.1.1.4 SP25-SPO2. That was a fixed level. I'm not making that up. And the downloaded ISO files show up, and you got to mount them, and then you pull out all these BFF files, and they're not your best friends forever either. You can do bulk FTP download, right? Just really not a friendly process. And if you've never done it, the first time you run the fixes, it comes along and says, hey, I saw 627 fixes over there. One of them will apply. What? What is that? One? Well, yeah, it turns out that one is the one that updates the OS enough to know what all the other fixes are. So you get a reboot, and then after that, it'll do more. But it's like, you're kidding me. One? Yeah, it's just not friendly. Device driver app installation. Well, in the IBM world, we ask, what's a device driver? It's all in there. So when? In the VIOS AIX world, each device needs a driver. Now, for the vast majority of the stuff used in power, that's going to be there. So we're not really going to have a problem. Many of the drivers are in there, but you will find, for example, that you need to install a driver now and then in the VIOS world. That is really an AIX item. How about firmware? IBM PTFs, remember those? They deliver an update firmware. So you put on PTFs, PTF says, hey, that RAID card needs a firmware update, and I have just the update you need. Here you go, right? And that's been a thing basically since the beginning of IBM time. In the VIOS world, there's a whole red book on this thing. And I'm not going to read that statement over there, but basically it says, you better pay attention, son. And when you do fixes on VIOS, it doesn't update adapter code. You get to go to Fix Central and you get to download code. And then you get to run query statements. It says, what's the code level on this adapter? Oh, it's 100002508. Oh, yeah, well, you need 2527. Oh, okay. So you download that. And in some cases, you even have to disable the adapter from being used before you can update the code. So definitely not a friendly process compared to IBMI. So big giant win again for IBMI in that space. Security of the host. Well, IBMI is impenetrable, right? It's the most bestest and unhack. Okay, that's not even true. But it is a securable host. It's solid, it's well known, it's documented. Each admin gets their own profile, they get their own password, they get their own sets of rights, and that's both service tools and in a regular OS. In VIOS, you can configure multiple users and you can do LDAP and some other things for security, but man, is it a pain in the butt. And then, even when you get in there as a different user, you do sudo, right, which is super user do for those that are not familiar with Linux and such. You do super user do to padmin again. And padmin is the QSecoffer equivalent for VIOS. So once you're in there, you can do anything again. So again, pretty strong win for IBMI in that space. Let's talk about save and restore a little bit. So host, partition, backup, and I'll call it quality. I say it's rock solid. You can easily save an installable image with a go save and option 21. And when you say save 21 in the IBMI world, everybody knows what you're talking about. Somebody tried to start a rumor once that IBM was going to renumber the save menu. And the rumor was that all the flights to Rochester booked up solid because we were all going to show up with our pitchforks and storm the castle. So they decided not to renumber the save menu. Very good choice on their part. But you can save the whole system with a 21. You can save 22, which is the IBMI parts, right? All the IBM stuff. You can even keep that backup current with save sys information. And did you know you can do a save 22 or even a save 21 on a host partition while the guest partitions are active and running? Yes, you can. You got to be careful because there's a couple parameters. If you take the defaults, you'll take them down. But you know what you're doing. You can do a save 21 on the host while it's running. One thing that's true, though, is if you want to save all your guests at the same time on that save 21, then they need to be shut down. That's important to know. In the VIOS world, you can use backup VIOS or backup iOS and VIOS BR to get a VIOS backup. It's complicated when you're not going to media. Statements like the one there are found in the documentation. So again, because we're IBMI people mostly, understanding this blue box on the left makes total sense. The thing on the green on the right is like, what are they even talking about? PIP? Really? Okay. Now, I mentioned this on the last slide, but can you save the client disks from the host? And the answer is yes, you can, because if you've ever seen this directory, QFPNWSSTG, and do you know where that thing got its name from? If you go way back to the beginning of this presentation, what was the first piece of hardware that I mentioned that hosted anything on OS 400? That was the Physiop. So of course this directory had to start with a Q. It's from IBM, I mean, really. FP was Physiop. And then network server storage. So QPhysiop network server storage. That's where all the virtual disks live for your client partitions. So you can use a standard save command and any variation thereof of saving those images. As I mentioned before, though, if those partitions are running, you cannot save that stuff because it's all locked. So you'd have to power off those partitions and then vary off the network server descriptions. And with that, you can then save everything. So this could be a great tool For migrating to a new server, if you have an IBM host, save the host, restore it to the new machine. You just did everything on one tape. And I've also used this in the case of we had a customer where they had this set up. We had done a backup like this because they needed to switch some drives around. And very soon after that, an unfortunate mistake was made by an IBM person and they lost the whole system. We were then able to take and restore that backup after fixing the drives, restore that backup, and then they were able to simply restore their nightly backups from the night before to get their client partitions running again. So could be a valid backup strategy, or at least part of a valid backup strategy. The VIOS side, again, you got to save those volumes, and it's just really not a usable setup there. So definitely a win for IBMI in that space. Oops, I was on the wrong screen. Didn't scroll. Um, does a full save include the hosted disks? As we mentioned, yes, it can, but it requires the guests to be varied off, right? And this is that full DR. In the case of VIOS, no, it doesn't. It's not a way to do that. Sharing of host tape drives. All right, so in the case of IBMI, by default, all tape drives up to a maximum of 8 of them are shared to clients automatically, right? And again, that's that thing where we said, do you want to share automatic or not share automatic? The default is to share them automatically. You can restrict them on there, or you can go the other way around when you configure your network server description and specify to omit everything and only share what you'd like to each customer, each client partition. All the sharing is over Virtual SCSI, which is cool. You can share libraries and drives. Some of you who've been doing this for long enough might remember that originally it was only drives, but libraries were added later. It does take a performance hit on the client if you're sharing from the host. The client does not get full performance of the tape drive. So if you do need high performance there, you may want to be able to switch the adapter in that case. But in the case of AIX, VIOS, you can map more than 8. That's not a problem. Each client has to be mapped individually. If it's fiber, you have to use NPIV to share. So in that case, it's not really sharing a tape, it's just passing fiber traffic. And you can share libraries as well as drives, but you cannot share a library that's connected directly to VIOS. It has to be shared through NPIV. All right, let's talk about SAN support. And here's an area where we're going to go way green because even though IBMI can be run on a SAN, and we do it a lot these days, flash systems, we sell a lot of flash systems. Customers really liking those. But realistically, if you're going to have a SAN, you're probably going and you want multiple partitions, you're probably going to go to VIOS because it's one of the things that VIOS does best, right? More SANs are supported, although that in itself isn't as big a deal anymore. But NPIV is supported here, and so the traffic is just passed along through VIOS. As opposed to if I'm virtualizing a SAN through IBMI, I present all the storage to that one IBMI partition, and then you use the create network server storage space on IBMI to run all the sharing. Okay. Overhead then. So you're writing to IBMI. IBMI then has to take it out of the buffer and write it to the SAN. So there's extra work going on there. And that's not really a recommended configuration for most customers. So big win for VIOS there. NPIV support, nope, can't do it on IBMI. And that means no mobility. So no live partition mobility or any of that sort of thing because that disk is dedicated to the IBMI host machine. Whereas over here on the AIX side, yeah, NPIV, which is required for mobility, is supported. Also, multiple paths over here. Another big key, multiple paths both VIOs give you paths to your storage. So one VIO goes down, you stay up and running. Can I install two and boot from a SAN? Yeah, absolutely. And realistically, the limited number of SANs isn't that big a deal anymore because it's pretty much all the storage from the last 5 or more years, all the flash systems and all the store-wise stuff. And I'm speaking about IBM storage here. If you're dealing with non-IBM storage, you really have to deal with your vendor of that device. And there are none of those that are currently supported by IBM as a target SAN. So um, you really need to go internal disk for IBM I. So host operating system disk support, and realistically here, dedicated arms for the host. Yeah, IBM I likes arms. Um, the default is to build them all into one ASP for IBM I, and but we mentioned before we like the idea of putting an independent ASP and putting all the storage in there for the clients. But in the VIOS space, the default is to mirror two disks, and then the client storage is on different disks. So that's really an identical configuration. We kind of don't care. Boot from SAN, as we mentioned, yep, you can boot on both sides, and in VIOS, you can also virtualize that disk very well. So pretty good win over here for VIO in that case. Can I extend the host OS disk? Well, this is IBM I over here. Of course, you know that stock and trade stuff. Um, in the older machines where you can pop the drives out the front, the disk drawer, some cases you can even add a disk drawer, no problem at all. You can stick more disks in and just include them. If it's RAID, you can add them to RAID sets, build new RAID sets, and for mirror, just put them in pairs and add them, right? And Shazam, you got more storage, not a problem. But for the most part, in the VIOS space, it's not friendly at all for the internal disk. This is internal disk. SanDisk, completely different picture because there you're just creating storage on the SAN and VIOS passes it through. So in the case of internal disks, if I needed to move disk, IBM I says, sure, I can move stuff around, right? Drain one drive, add new drives, right? I've got smaller drives. I need to put in bigger drives. I can drain the small ones, put in the big ones, or I can add more. All of that. I only need an outage if I want to move those client disks between independent ASP or between an ASP and an independent ASP, for example. Can I do it on a VIOS world? No, I really got to shut everything down in order to do that. There's not tools within VIOS to do this disk move thing. Can I spread storage across arms? Yeah, it's automatic in IBM I. So if I have a set of 10 disks and my client disks, every time I create a client disk, that storage is spread across those 10 arms. It's just automatic. It's the way it works, right? Within VIOS, you can spread across the RAID set, but you need to use LVM or Logical Volume Manager to go any further than that. So generally, again, we just don't do VIOS much with internal disk. That's really the purview of IBM I. So for mirrored disks, yeah, well supported. And in fact, if you have a new Power 10, that's all we got anymore because everything is NVMe. And NVMe, we don't do RAID on it. We just mirror it. So that's exactly what we did. But if I do have an older machine, I can have mirrored disks and rated disks added together. And if I add more disks, then it just adds them as at mirrored state. In the VIOS world, it doesn't really know how, and support doesn't know how. It's really a pain because they don't do this, right? They use SAN storage. So they kind of look at you funny, and you want to do what on internal disk? It doesn't even make sense, right? How are disks mirrored? IBM I is very smart that way. If I have two big NVMEs and they're sliced into 400 gig slices, and I say mirror them, it will mirror the two NVMEs to each other. It doesn't mirror two drives on this NVMe together and two drives on this NVMe together. That would be silly because it's very unlikely that you're going to lose one volume on a single NVMe device. You're going to lose the whole device, right? So IBMI is very smart that way. Disks and VIOS, though, you're doing that. So again, we don't like that. In a drive failure in a mirrored environment, IBMI, um, one drive is dead. You got one pair down, and everything else is still mirrored. In the VIOS, the entire volume group becomes unprotected. So again, another reason why we don't like internal disk with VIOS. And this is just statistics, right? If I have 8 drives mirrored 4x4, the second drive that fails, there's a 14% chance I lose the whole system. With 20 drives, the second drive is only 5%. But here, look at this. 4x4, the second drive is a 57% chance because it's 4 out of 7. Woo, not good. All right, NVMe, as we noted, that's all sliced into 200 or 400 gig slices, and the cards are mirrored. So as I mentioned, you're very unlikely to lose a slice. You're going to lose an entire card. So that's why we, in that case, you're probably going to end up with all your disks unmirrored while you replace it. But we've not seen NVMe failures much at all, right? Host mirrored disk replacement, kind of a pain here, so not going to go over the whole detail, but we do know how that works in IBMI. IBMI, you can do hot spare. VIOS, no hot spare. Duplication of disks, again, and why would I do this? I can take the guest disks on an IBMI partition and copy them, and now I have a whole copy of the partition. Sweet, right? I can do it in AIX, but man, you don't want to. It's an AIX command line only thing. One of the cool things for IBMI is when you create a client disk in the host and then you assign it to the target, the client, when you go to use it, boom, it instantly formats because it was formatted when it was built. So that's way cool. In the AIX world, that's not the way that works. Concurrent hosting of all these things, well, today we're down to AIX, Linux, and IBMI on both sides, and so it's really, I should move this slider over now because it's really dead even. We both do the same. Windows and ESX are gone. Can I disconnect virtual disks? If I'm taking them away, the answer is no. I can over here on the VIOS world, but in the IBMI world, that's not a supported process. So internal disk support, we give VIOS a D for internal disk, and IBMI gets the A. All right, one last thing, advanced technologies. Can I do active memory expansion, which oddly is actually compression? And IBMI, no, and we can't even be a client there. But for Enterprise Edition, and it's standard on Power 9, I can do that. Memory is compressed and it makes it look like there's more memory. I can do that with VIOS. Active memory sharing, IBMI can participate as a client here, but only as a client. And in Enterprise Edition, I can take unused memory from a partition. It gets written to disk, and then I can let another partition use that memory. So it's kind of borrowing, right? Live partition mobility says take a partition that's running and all my users are on it and they're happy and move it from power system A to power system B on the fly. Okay. And that is a cool thing that has many, many shops like that. There are software licensing issues with that, but it is a powerful tool. I can be a client with IBMI, but I can't host it, right? So I have to do Enterprise Edition, and again, remember Enterprise Edition is included on all Power 9s, and it has to have 100% client virtual. Suspend resume is the same thing. I can suspend a partition if it's hosted by VIOS. I cannot if it's hosted by IBMI. Dual host support, yeah, that's stock and trade. We would always do dual hosts in the VIOS world. In an IBM world, it would be a silly thing to do because I'd have to buy double the disk. So there's your scorecard. How'd you do? What did you think? Um, what are your hot buttons? Was there something that moved you one way or the other? Um, or did you already implement and you realize you goofed, right? Could go both ways. So thanks for attending.